Socialism is bad because socialism is tyranny.
Any socialist country devolves into disaster.
Socialism repeatedly leads to violence.
Name a communist leader that hasn't killed thousands of people. I'll wait.
Socialism always devolves into dictatorship.
Name a U.S. president that hasn't killed thousands of people. I'll wait.
Ooh.
Socialism always leads to dictatorship. I'm sure you've heard something along those lines before. It's quite the provocative statement, and it does a good job at shutting down the conversation before it starts, but it leaves out a lot of context that might be worth talking about. It's true that some past socialist experiments exhibited autocratic and undesirable traits that we shouldn't glorify. It's also true that a lot of these societies achieved impressive accomplishments in areas such as healthcare, houselessness, employment, and development, but those always seem to get swept under the rug. Look, these past societies are not above criticism, and leftists do so all the time. But it's important to keep in mind that you can't expect a wholly humane society to form from incredibly inhumane conditions. What do I mean by that? Take Cuba, for example. Cuba was subjected to invasion, embargo, bombing, and many assassination attempts on their leader. This stuff breeds paranoia and autocracy. It's understandable, yet undesirable and unfortunate to see autocratic tendencies emerge from this. But to chastise Cuba without mentioning everything I just did is ignoring the material context. I'm not trying to minimize any of the suffering or atrocities these past societies were responsible for or absolve them of blame. We should criticize the things about them that we don't want to recreate and avoid glorifying them while still understanding the conditions that led to them. These places didn't turn authoritarian or autocratic or tyrannical or whatever word you want to use because these outcomes were baked into the concept of socialism. There is nothing integral to the idea of worker control of the means of production and the democratization of the workplace that necessitates dictatorship. Authoritarianism reared its ugly head in some of these past societies, partly because they were constantly under attack with little respite. Capitalist societies would and have ditched their purported love for democracy for a lot less, and as a result of an integral component of capitalism's design. As we remain indoctrinated by neoliberal ideology and market fundamentalism, our economic model demands constant growth, constant profit, and new markets. This results in the need for new frontiers, and in the eyes of the capitalist world, there is no better frontier to exploit than the already overexploited, underdeveloped world. Everywhere we go, we are lectured and reminded of how socialism always turns to tyranny, but we never stop to examine our current economic model, capitalism, and how, by its very design, it allows for the rapid concentration of wealth, meaning the already ultra-rich continue to accrue wealth at an exponential rate while the average person struggles. It doesn't take long for these concentrations of wealth to begin to wield the power to influence politicians and governments. I mean, we have historical examples of fucking banana companies convincing the US government to overthrow countries. This system gets undemocratic very quickly. So in this video, I thought we should go over some of the many times when Western capitalist forces not only propped up tyrannical dictators to protect their capital and investments around the world, but overthrew democratically elected leaders to do so. In other words, the times when the democracy-loving Western capitalists protected democracy from what they called communists by overthrowing democracy. Quick disclaimer, on this channel, I've already gone over examples of this happening many times. I've touched on the overthrow of the democratically elected Marxist president of Chile and how he was replaced by the murderous US-backed right-wing dictator Augusto Pinochet. I've also spoken ad nauseum about Jacobo Arbenz, the democratically elected leader of Guatemala who was overthrown by the CIA and the United Fruit Company to protect US profits. Both of these incidents resulted in thousands of innocent deaths. If you want more on these two specific cases of US intervention, I have videos dedicated to both topics. I won't rehash all the details here. With that out of the way, you may be familiar with the company British Petroleum, or BP. Well, it used to go by a different name. It was originally called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and it was a British corporation that had a very strong presence in early 20th century Iran. It tightly controlled and exploited Iranian oil while only giving a very small percentage of the profits to Iran. It was another classic example of a Western capitalist power exploiting another country and practically stealing its wealth. To quote American journalist Stephen Kinzer's Aldous Shaw's Men, the wealth that flowed from beneath Iran's soil played a decisive role in maintaining Britain at the pinnacle of world power, while most Iranians lived in poverty. In the early 1950s, a man by the name of Mohammad Mosaddegh sought to change that. Mosaddegh rode to power on a wave of anti-colonial sentiment and promised to push back on British control of Iranian resources so he could use the oil and its revenue to help his people. He requested an audit of the British-controlled oil company because he suspected that it was cheating Iranians out of the profits they were owed. But the oil company refused. It would not open its books to Iranian auditors. This led to Mosaddegh convincing the Iranian parliament to agree to his nationalization plans. Britain was obviously pissed at this and led a global economic boycott of Iran, but many Iranians still supported Mosaddegh in the midst of this boycott because he served as a symbol of anti-colonial resistance. Under Winston Churchill, the British government decided that they had to overthrow Mosaddegh and replace him with someone more friendly to Western interests. The Americans, under Eisenhower, got involved too, and you might be wondering why. Wasn't it mostly Britain that benefited from the oil? Well, the US had a few reasons. First, if countries in the imperial periphery started nationalizing their resources and kicking out foreign influence, it would set a dangerous precedent for American interests, considering their own involvement all over the world. The US had a vested interest in keeping Western companies in control of resources, not local governments. Second, the US feared the growing presence of communism in Iran and worried that it might fall to Soviet influence and shut itself off from Western business altogether. The plan to replace Mosaddegh with the Shah of Iran had begun. At the time, the Shah held a largely symbolic position with little real political power, but the UK and the US wanted to change that and turn him into the supreme ruler of Iran because they felt that he could be molded into a pro-Western puppet. In preparation for the coup, British and American intelligence agencies launched a massive propaganda campaign within Iran to sabotage Mosaddegh. As Stephen Kinzer explains, mobs working for the CIA staged anti-Mosaddegh protests, marching through the streets carrying portraits of the Shah and chanting royalist slogans. Foreign agents bribed members of parliament and anyone who might be helpful in the forthcoming coup attempt. Press attacks on Mosaddegh reached new levels of virulence. Although Mosaddegh did not know it, most of these tirades were either inspired by the CIA or written by CIA propagandists in Washington. Eisenhower and Churchill successfully orchestrated the coup against Mosaddegh in 1953. He was placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life. General Zahedi, working with US and UK intelligence, replaced him as prime minister and facilitated the Shah's consolidation of power, allowing him to rule as an absolute monarch, just as the West intended. Declassified CIA documents also own up to the US and UK's nefarious intent by outright admitting that they overthrew Mosaddegh because he was bad for American business and not mean enough to the communists. With near absolute authority, the Shah quickly appeased Western business interests at the expense of his own people. His brutal rule was known for extreme suppression, torture, kidnappings, and murder. Amnesty International reported on the Shah's horrendous human rights record in 1976, explaining how freedom of speech was non-existent, as were many other freedoms. Trade unions and protesting workers were severely dealt with and often killed. Political opposition was heavily restricted, and the report even talks about how professors were targeted and tortured for teaching courses that did not conform to the ideology of the white revolution of the Shah. Doesn't that sound exactly like the horrors people accuse communist regimes of committing? Well, this was the Shah's Iran acting at the behest of the capitalist West to ensure a conducive environment for their capitalist endeavors, all at the expense of democracy. The people's hatred for the Shah and what he represented, Western influence, culminated in protests and riots against his tyrannical rule, allowing religious fundamentalist groups to rally support from the discontented population. The people wanted Western influence out of their country, so they turned to the forces willing to get that job done. This resulted in the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the replacement of the Shah with Ayatollah Khomeini. To sum it all up, there was a democratically elected leader who the people supported. The UK and the US replaced him with a man that the people did not like because he would be friendly to Western capitalists, and then the people overthrew him. Now Iran is a theocracy. Let's look at the next one. Just like in Mossadegh's Iran, João Goulart in Brazil was also pushing for left-wing policies, particularly labor and land reforms and some nationalizations. Western capitalist nations, especially the US, rely heavily on cheap, exploited labor in the developing world. The best way to ensure that this labor force doesn't rise up and demand humane working conditions or, God forbid, unionize, is to install a right-wing dictator or a military regime who will crack down on them on the behalf of Western corporations. We've seen this in Argentina, where the US-backed military dictatorship was heavily funded by Washington and served to protect Ford Motor Company's profits, violently cracking down on workers. We've seen it in Pinochet's Chile and pretty much everywhere the US installed or supported a despotic regime. In the case of Goulart in Brazil, the story goes like this. João Goulart, also known as Django, assumed the presidency of Brazil legally and democratically in 1961. His rise to power was heavily contested by the military and the country's elite and other conservative factions. Jango was by no means a radical. He definitely leaned left, but that didn't mean much in the context of 1960s Brazil, which had a right-leaning political landscape. To quote Vincent Benvins' The Jakarta Method, the democracy Brazil set up after World War II was very limited. Striking was illegal. Because of literacy requirements, a majority of the population, mostly black, very poor Brazilians, was barred from voting. Jango and his supporters wanted to change this. Although not a communist or even a full-fledged socialist, his policies were influenced by socialist ideas. He cooperated with communists and pushed through progressive reforms that earned him strong support from the working class, but severe animosity from Brazil's elite, the conservative military, and of course, the US. Jango knew that he couldn't rely too heavily on Brazil's political insiders who were not fans of his left-wing policies, so he doubled down and rallied the support of everyday people and historically neglected groups. He was a true populist. He fought against unfair voting restrictions, implemented literacy programs, and, despite being a large landowner himself, backed a land reform program aimed at redistributing unused land to Brazil's landless peasants. This angered the small but powerful ruling class who, largely as a continuation of colonial landholding practices, controlled the majority of the land. In addition to all this, he passed a law limiting the amount of profits multinationals could transmit out of the country, and a subsidiary of ITT, an American corporation, was nationalized, as noted by journalist William Blum. The Americans, who disliked Goulart from the start, quickly joined Brazil's already anti-Goulart right wing to paint him as a wannabe dictator. The CIA spent millions funding his opposition, heavily pushing the idea that he would destroy democracy. CIA-backed right-wing newspapers spread these falsehoods, while the US also financed mass demonstrations and did everything possible to stoke tensions and support the right-wing military in overthrowing Goulart. By the time the day of the coup arrived, the US had supplied petroleum to the military, dispatched a Navy task force to Brazil's coast to intimidate opposition, and sent arms and ammunition to support the coup. Long story short, Goulart was overthrown and he fled to Uruguay. So now that this wannabe communist dictator was gone, you would think that the US and the Brazilian right wing would jump at the opportunity to salvage Brazilian democracy and restore free and fair elections. That was the whole point, right? Well, the opposite happened. The military dictatorship went on to arrest thousands of civilians merely for being suspected of being communists. Unions were purged, Congress was shut down, political opposition was nearly non-existent, criticizing the new government became a crime, and protesters were shot and killed. Systemic disappearances became a defining characteristic of the new regime. Peasants had their homes burned down, and of course, there were the infamous right-wing death squads that came to prominence. Brazil would not see another free and fair election for 25 years. All of this came about largely due to the help and the support of the freedom-loving capitalist USA. For the last example, I was thinking of going over the Argentine military dictatorship, but decided against it because it's pretty similar to the case we just discussed, so let's move over to another continent and look at the story of Patrice Lumumba in Congo. I'll keep this brief because I don't want this video to drag on, and I've covered this story on this channel before, but it goes like this. Patrice Lumumba was the first democratically elected leader of Congo. Prior to his leadership, Congo had been a Belgian colony where Belgium exploited its natural resources for decades, with other Western powers invited to share in the profits. Congo has always been home to immense mineral wealth, from copper to cobalt to diamonds, and this did not go unnoticed by Western interests who couldn't keep their grubby paws off the country. But those Western business interests were quickly threatened once Lumumba took the reins. To quote an op-ed from Adam Hochschild published in the New York Times, the Belgians and their European and American fellow investors expected to continue collecting profits from Congo's factories, plantations, and lucrative mines, which produced diamonds, gold, uranium, copper, and more. But they had not planned on Lumumba. Lumumba proclaimed that he would use the Congo's wealth to lift its people out of poverty and develop the nation. To do so, he would have to nationalize the resources that had been expropriated by Western capitalist interests. But as we know from the two previous examples in this video, the capitalist West will literally kill to prevent a country from exercising self-determination. Lumumba's nationalization attempts led the head of the CIA, Alain Dulles, to call for his removal as an urgent and prime objective. Like Mosaddegh in Iran and Goulart in Brazil, Lumumba was not a communist. Not that it would matter if he was, it wouldn't justify what the US did, but he was nonetheless framed as one to manufacture consent for his takedown. And you could probably guess what happened next. Lumumba was deposed in a coup that Blum referred to as designed by the United States. He was later assassinated, and Congo fell under the dictatorial rule of Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled the country brutally but maintained friendly business relations with the US. His people lived in horrendous poverty, but funnily enough, Seko was known to be quite wealthy himself. I wonder how that happened. I hope this video didn't feel too repetitive. It's just, there are only so many ways to tell the same story, and I barely scratched the surface. From Guatemala, Chile, and Indonesia to the Philippines, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, these are just a few of the many countries where the US propped up despotic right-wing figures to protect its hegemony and profits. So next time someone tells you that socialism leads to dictatorship due to an innate component of its design, ask them how exactly worker control of the means of production and democratic workplaces is intrinsically dictatorial. Then kindly contrast that with the many times capitalism, due to its very design, the need for unlimited profit, new frontiers, and new extraction zones, has not only resulted in the deaths of millions and unfathomable ecological devastation, but has also required the support of fascist dictators to protect the interests of capital, almost always propped up and supported by the Western capitalist nations of the world.